Hey everyone, my name is Sarah and I'm from Pennsylvania. I grew up in an old order Amish community and I left when I was 21 years old. I know a lot of you have questions about what life was really like behind those plain dresses and slow moving buggies. And today I want to talk about something that almost nobody discusses openly: intimacy and relationships in the Amish world, and what it was actually like trying to adjust to modern life after I walked away from everything I had ever known. I want to be clear about what this is and what it isn't. This is not going to be a romanticized story dressed up to make the Amish life look like something from a peaceful painting. It is also not an attack on anyone. The people I grew up with are real people. My family are real people. I carry love for them even now, even when that love is complicated and heavy and sometimes hard to hold. These are just my experiences, my truth, the things I wish someone had told me before I made the hardest decision of my life and stepped out of the only world I had ever known. So let's start from the very beginning. When you grow up Amish, you don't get the talk. I mean that literally. There is no sit-down conversation about the birds and the bees. Nobody hands you a book. Nobody explains what is going to happen on your wedding night or what your body is capable of or what you might feel. The understanding, unspoken, simply assumed, is that nature will take its course and you will figure it out, as though the absence of information is itself a kind of guidance, as though confusion is the same thing as innocence. My mother never once talked to me about intimacy, not once, in 21 years of living in her home. The closest thing I received to any kind of preparation was a single sentence she offered when I was engaged. She told me that marriage is a sacred duty and that I needed to be obedient to my future husband. That was it. That was the entirety of my preparation for one of the most significant experiences of my adult life. I carried that sentence with me into my marriage, like a tool that didn't quite fit the job it was meant for. Sacred duty, obedient. Those words I understood. What they didn't give me was any understanding of my own body, my own needs, or the simple human truth that intimacy between two people is supposed to involve both of them. Dating in the Amish community is completely different from anything people in the outside world experience, and the differences start long before anyone gets to a wedding night. It typically begins around the age of 16, and in the early stages, it is done almost entirely in secret. The starting point is usually small and quiet. A boy offering you a ride home from a Sunday evening singing. If you accept, something has begun. There are no announcements, no introductions to parents, not yet. It begins in the margins, in the small spaces between community oversight. But here is something that always surprises people when I explain it. Even after something has started, even after you are officially courting, even after you are engaged, there is no physical contact in public. None. No holding hands while walking together, no brief kiss in front of family, no arm around your shoulder in a way that anyone might see. The Amish believe that love and physical affection belong entirely in the private sphere, completely hidden from community view. And that belief is not a suggestion, it is a rule, and it is enforced by the silent, constant awareness that you are always being observed. Now, you may have heard about bundling. It's also called bed courtship. And yes, it is real. And yes, it happened in my community. After a date, a boy would come to your family's home late in the evening. You and he would lie in bed together, fully clothed, for the night. Sometimes there was a bundling board placed between you, a literal physical barrier. Sometimes it was just a blanket and the understanding that you were expected to keep your hands to yourselves. The stated purpose was that you could talk through the night and genuinely get to know each other. Your thoughts, your faith, your hopes, without any physical contact getting in the way. It was designed to build something emotional and spiritual before anything physical was permitted. It was supposed to teach self-discipline. But here is the part that nobody talks about. It did not always work that way. A significant number of couples did have sex before marriage, despite the absolute prohibition. The secrecy of bundling, the darkness, the physical closeness of two young people who had never been alone together before, these things combined in ways that the practice's designers might not have intended or might simply have preferred not to acknowledge. And if you got caught or if you got pregnant, you had to stand up in front of the entire church congregation and confess what you had done before you were permitted to get married. The shame of that public confession was the community's chosen form of consequence. And I can tell you from watching it happen to people I cared about that it was consequential. Standing in front of hundreds of people who have known you your entire life and admitting what you did in the dark, that is something that stays with you. It marks you. It becomes part of how you see yourself for a long time afterward. I remember my wedding day with a clarity that hasn't faded in all the years since. I was 20 years old. I barely knew my husband. We had been courting for about 8 months, but we had never truly been alone together. We had never had a conversation that wasn't happening inside the awareness that we were being observed. I did not know what he sounded like when he was afraid. I did not know what made him laugh when no one was watching. I did not know him. We got married on a Tuesday in November after the harvest season. No white dress, no rings exchanged, no photographs taken to remember the day by. I wore a new blue dress that I had made myself, my best work, the most care I had ever put into a garment. We stood in front of the church and we made our vows in front of the community that had raised us both. That night, we stayed in a spare bedroom that had been prepared for us at his parents' house. Nobody told me what to expect. I was terrified in a way that I couldn't have described then and can barely describe now. A full-body fear that had no specific object because I didn't know enough to be afraid of anything specific. I was simply afraid of the unknown in every direction. My husband wasn't much better. He had grown up with the same absence of information that I had. We both came to that night carrying nothing useful. No knowledge, no language, no framework for what was supposed to happen between us. We fumbled through it, and honestly, it was awkward and uncomfortable, and nothing like what I would later learn it could be. There was no romance in it. There was no tenderness. There was just a shared, wordless understanding that this was our duty as a newly married couple, and that duty needed to be fulfilled. I lay in the dark afterward, and I felt nothing. Not happiness, not closeness, not the beginning of something. Just the quiet, flat awareness that something had happened, and that tomorrow would begin a life I did not yet understand. What I didn't understand that night, what I wouldn't understand for years, was how much I had been taught to suppress. Amish women are raised to be modest in everything. Modest in dress, modest in speech, modest in the space they take up in the world. You are taught to lower your eyes. You are taught to never draw attention to yourself, your appearance, your body. You are taught that your job is to be useful, obedient, and quiet. Your body is not really yours. That is the operating understanding, even if no one ever says it in those exact words. Your body belongs first to God, then to your father, then, when you marry, to your husband. The idea that you might have your own desires, that intimacy might be something you were allowed to enjoy rather than simply endure, was never once suggested to me. Not by my mother, not by the church, not by any woman I knew growing up. Enjoyment was not part of the framework. Duty was, endurance was, submission was. I carried all of that into my marriage without knowing I was carrying it, without knowing there was any other way to be, and I would carry it for a long time after I left too. Because the beliefs you absorb in childhood don't dissolve when you cross a geographical line. They stay. They live in your body long after your mind has started to question them. Leaving was not a single moment. It was a long, slow accumulation of questions that I had no permission to ask and no safe place to ask them. I left when I was 21, before I had been baptized into the church. That timing matters. In Amish communities, baptism is the point of formal commitment, the moment you declare, as an adult, that you choose this life and this faith. Once you are baptized and then leave, you are officially shunned. Your family is required by church rules to cut off contact with you. Meals cannot be shared. Certain communications become forbidden. The person you were is treated in some formal sense as no longer existing. Because I left before baptism, my situation was technically less severe. There was no official shunning. But less severe is a relative term when most of your family still won't speak to you. I miss my family every single day. I want to say that clearly because I don't want anyone to hear my story and think that leaving was clean or simple or without cost. It was none of those things. Most of them won't speak to me now. The ones who do so carefully, aware that their relationship with me is something the community watches. Even without an official shunning, the pressure to distance yourself from someone who left is enormous and constant. I don't regret leaving, but I grieve what leaving cost me every single day. Both of those things are true at the same time. Welcome back. My name is Sarah. In part 1, I told you about growing up Amish in Pennsylvania, the silence around intimacy, the rules around courtship, my wedding day, and the decision to leave at 21. In part 2, I want to tell you what happened after. What it was like to step into the modern world carrying everything I had been taught and trying to figure out how to live differently. It is not a simple story. It is not a clean story. But it is an honest one. And honesty is the only thing I have to offer. The first time a man in the English world tried to hold my hand on a date, I pulled away without thinking. It was a reflex. Immediate and complete. He looked confused, and I didn't have the words to explain what had just happened inside me because I barely understood it myself. I had been taught my entire life that physical contact before marriage was sinful, not uncomfortable, not inadvisable, but sinful, morally wrong, evidence of something broken in the person who allowed it. Even though I had left the church, even though I had physically removed myself from the community and was living an entirely different kind of life, those beliefs were still hardwired into me at a level below conscious thought. They lived in my body, in my reflexes. Learning to date in the modern world was like being handed a book written in a language I had never studied and being expected to read it fluently. People expected things from me that I had no framework for. They assumed I knew things I had never been taught. They spoke openly and casually about attraction and desire and physical connection in ways that made my chest tighten with something I couldn't immediately identify. Shame, probably, and also a kind of grief for all the years I had spent believing that those conversations were forbidden. Women in the English world had opinions about what they wanted. They stated those opinions directly. They negotiated. They made requests. They said no to things and yes to things, and the whole thing was built on this assumption I had never encountered before, that both people in a relationship were equal participants with equal voices and equal rights to their own preferences. That was completely foreign to me, and learning it felt for a long time like failing at something everyone else had been doing naturally since adolescence. One of the hardest and most significant things I had to learn after leaving was that I was allowed to say no. In the Amish world, particularly as a woman, particularly as a wife, you don't really have that option in any ongoing way. Your husband has certain rights within marriage, and you have certain corresponding duties. That is the framework. There is no language for consent as something ongoing. Something fluid, something you could give in one moment and withdraw in another based on your own feelings and needs. The idea that your body's availability to your husband was something you had continuous, daily agency over, that was not something I had ever been taught. It was, in fact, the opposite of what I had been taught. When I first heard the word consent used in the context of intimate relationships, in a real conversation, not just in passing, I sat with it for a long time afterward. I turned it over in my mind. Consent. The idea that your yes had to be a real yes, freely given, not assumed or required or taken as given by virtue of the vows you had made. The idea that your no was valid and complete and did not require justification. It was revolutionary to me, genuinely revolutionary, not in an abstract intellectual way, in a way that changed something at the center of how I understood myself and my body and my right to exist in it on my own terms. It took me years to fully believe it. The understanding came before the belief. I could state it as a fact long before I could feel it as a truth. One of the biggest pieces of work I had to do after leaving, and it was work, sustained and deliberate, was unlearning shame. I had been taught from childhood that thinking about sex was sinful, that enjoying it was wrong, that your body was something to be carefully hidden, never celebrated, treated with suspicion rather than curiosity or appreciation, that any kind of sexuality was, at its root, a danger, a force that could lead people astray, that needed to be suppressed and controlled and never, under any circumstances, acknowledged as something that belonged to you. When I started therapy, my therapist told me that many formerly Amish women struggle significantly with intimacy precisely because this shame is so deeply ingrained. It is not a surface-level belief. It was planted in us before we had the cognitive development to examine or question it. It grew roots in us during our most formative years. We were taught from the time we were small children that our bodies were dangerous, that they could lead men astray, that covering them and suppressing everything associated with them was not just modesty, but moral necessity. Unlearning that is not a single conversation. It is not a book you read or a realization you have one afternoon that changes everything. It is slow, patient, sometimes painful work. It involves sitting with feelings that your whole history says you should be ashamed of and practicing the act of not being ashamed of them. It involves learning to trust your own body instead of viewing it as an adversary that must be managed. I am still doing that work. I suspect I will be doing it for the rest of my life in some form. But I am further along than I was, and that matters. The other thing that genuinely shocked me about the modern world, and I don't use the word shocked lightly, was how much choice people had. In the Amish community, you marry young, typically somewhere between 20 and 22. You marry someone from within your community, someone who shares your faith and your way of life. There are no other real options. Divorce is not an option. You stay together regardless of what the marriage looks like from the inside, regardless of whether you are happy, regardless of whether you are treated well, regardless of what happens behind closed doors. You stay. That is the expectation and the requirement. The concept of leaving a relationship that wasn't working, of deciding that you deserved something better and going to find it, that did not exist in the world I came from. When I discovered that people in the English world dated multiple people over the course of their lives, that they lived together before marriage or chose not to marry at all, that they ended relationships that made them unhappy and began new ones, that they made choices about their romantic and intimate lives based on what they actually wanted, I didn't know how to process it at first. It felt almost reckless, as though all of that freedom must come with some corresponding danger I hadn't yet identified. It took time to understand that the freedom wasn't the danger. The danger had been the lack of it. Here is what I want you to understand, and I mean this with everything I have. Even though I struggled, even though the adjustment was hard in ways I am still navigating, even though I carry things from my Amish upbringing that I will probably always carry, learning about healthy relationships, real intimacy, and what genuine connection between two people can look like has been one of the most healing experiences of my life. I learned that communication matters, that both people's needs are real and valid and important. I learned that intimacy can be about genuine connection, about knowing and being known, and not only about obligation or duty or the fulfillment of someone else's right. I learned that I am allowed to have boundaries, that stating what I need is not selfishness, that respecting another person's boundaries and having mine respected in return is what real care between people actually looks like. Not the performance of submission, not the suppression of self, actual mutual care. I learned that my desires are not evidence of corruption, that my body is not a danger I need to manage, that the things I feel are not sins I need to confess. I am still learning. I don't want to make this sound like a story with a clean ending because it doesn't have one. Some days are harder than others. Some memories are heavier than others. Some old reflexes still fire before I have the chance to choose differently. But I am learning, and that is everything. I'm not going to pretend that leaving was easy or that I don't sometimes miss the life I walked away from. I miss the simplicity of it. I miss the deep sense of belonging that comes from being part of a community that has known you your entire life. I miss my family, the particular and irreplaceable people who raised me in ways that don't get easier with time. But I couldn't stay in a world where I had to make myself smaller to fit, where I couldn't ask questions about my own life without those questions being treated as a spiritual failing, where intimacy was something to be afraid of instead of something that could bring two people genuinely close to each other. I couldn't stay in a world where I didn't belong to myself. If you are formerly Amish, or if you grew up in any community where these kinds of rules governed your body, your relationships, your sense of what you were allowed to want, I want you to know something. It is okay to feel confused. It is okay to need a significant amount of time to figure out who you are outside the structure that defined you. It is okay to need therapy and to sit in that office working through beliefs that were planted in you before you were old enough to examine them. It is okay to take years. It is okay if the work is slow. You are not broken. You are not damaged beyond repair. You are not too far behind to catch up. You are simply learning something that you should have been taught a long time ago, and the learning is happening now, and that is enough. And if you are someone who has never been Amish, but has spent this time with my story, I hope it gave you something real. The Amish are not a curiosity. They are not a picturesque community that exists for outsiders to find charming. They are real people, living full and complicated lives inside a structure of rules that controls everything, including the parts of a human life that should, by any reasonable measure, belong to the person living it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, leave them in the comments. I read everything and I answer as many as I can. And if this video reached something in you, please share it. There are a lot of people out there who grew up the way I grew up, in silence, without information, without permission to know themselves, and I want them to know that they are not alone. My name is Sarah, and this is my truth. Sarah, former Old Order Amish, Pennsylvania.